to item 10, which is the inquiry into the elections and the submission that we're making to the Justice Committee. Can I pro forma move that? Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Young. And could we also add in as a new B, yep, it's up there already, the amendments by Councillor Casey, which I and the seconder are happy to accept. So that will go up for discussion. And we have also changed to the C to reflect the other feedback that we've had from other boards. And we will need to make a decision under D as to who will represent us at the Justice Committee hearing. I did hear, Councillor Darby, that you'd volunteered. That is genuine. He did. I'm not just putting him on the spot. So when we get to that, gratefully accept your agreement to do that. Maybe in Auckland, maybe in Wellington. So if I can welcome Rose and Warwick back to the table and ask you please to speak to the item.
Your Worship and Councillors, just a few brief comments. First aspect I draw your attention to is the Select Committee's report on its inquiry into the 2016 elections and the outcome of the Council's submissions, which overall was very pleasing. The Council's submissions on online voting, a legislative mandate to promote elections, and access to electoral roll data were all enacted before the committee's inquiry completed. The committee, in its report, supported our submissions on extraordinary vacancies occurring after an election, shifting polling day to avoid school holidays, aligning overseas voting processes with processes available for general elections, and allowing the electronic receipt of nominations and allowing access to the supplementary roll. That process, though, is not over. The Select Committee report following the next step in the process, as I understand it, is a response from the government to those recommendations. The draft submission in front of you responds to the matters in the committee's terms of reference, and in section 3 raises other matters that are additional to the terms of reference. The covering report does not necessarily duplicate the submission, but summarises the main points. And just the final comment that the draft submission does not comment on Energy Trust elections. The Council's not involved in running these elections, and from a staff point of view, there is no comment that we can provide you on those. Thank you.
Thank you, Warwick. In terms of, because this is on a submission and there may be individual aspects of the submission that I or councillors would want to change, I'm just seeking advice on what the best way to do that. For example, I foreshadowed before that having a special section on disclosure of candidates with serious criminal convictions and barring people from running again, I don't think that is appropriate. I think we should be consistent with the government, the overall general election principle. Do we need to move that specifically, or can you simply take that on board after getting an indication of councillor feeling? The other question that comes up, I know you've just mentioned the question of the entrust elections, but really you've got to raise some questions, and it's similar to the district health boards. If you get a 12% turnout, that just makes a joke of democracy. 12%, how does it reflect it? And my guess is that if we moved the district health board elections to be separate, you'd probably get that or arguably even less voting for the district health board. So the submission might want to make some general point about where there is a body that is being elected where people don't understand the role of elected members and don't know who the elected members are, and say consistently to us, this doesn't make sense, how can I participate? To ask at least the government to review the electoral nature of putting people on the boards for those organisations. So I might just get you to, if I take the first question slot, just to comment on those two things.
In terms of the process, Your Worship, it would be helpful in the resolutions that are passed, which adopt the draft submission, to have added to them with the removal of section 6 and with the amendment of such and such, so to give us a guide as to what we need to change. And then the final, in F, the meeting agrees to authorise the General Manager Democracy Services to take that away, make the appropriate changes in consultation with yourself or your office. In terms of the Energy Trust, initial feeling was that it wasn't relevant to running the Auckland Council elections, but as staff we didn't make any comment, but as politicians you may wish to make the comments that you just outlined. More recently it did occur to me that if the message that comes across about Energy Trust is to do with the low turnout, then the committee might actually consider including Energy Trust elections in with the local authority ones, and I'm not sure what we feel about that. Yep.
Okay, so if I just foreshadow a motion of that nature for the removal of section 6, others may have different opinions on that, happy to listen to that, and with the addition of asking for a review of election bodies with low electoral understanding and interest and voting turnout. So we're simply asking the government to review it, and I think they ought to do so. So I'll foreshadow that, but now we'll go to questions, and I have Councillor Bartley up first.
Sorry, I don't have a question. I just spoke to Councillor Darby, and he was okay if my name can be put forward to speak to the Justice Committee on this.
Okay. When we get to that, we'll. So I've now had it go from the Deputy Mayor to Councillor Darby to Councillor Bartley, but I'm happy if whoever wants to take on that responsibility gratefully receive their offer. Others may also be interested. Councillor Coombe.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I should start by making a declaration before I ask my question that I did stand for the Entrust election, that Auckland Energy Consumer Trust election, as an independent in 2009, and found it the most dispiriting experience because I had no idea that it wasn't run like a democratic election. And with appalling turnout, no media about it, the electorate basically bribed into the timing of when the voting was happening, and voting papers going out, a whole lot of issues with it. And one of the big factors of that election is it's not run under the Electoral Act. And so candidates can basically put up hoardings saying whatever they want. You can have the trustees interfering with the election, which they did, and did dictate to the returning officer to not promote the last election. So I do feel I've got a bit of history with this election. And so just coming at it as a candidate and from the democratic side of it, I do think it reflects badly on Auckland Council as well. Like it just is an election that our Aucklanders should be encouraged to participate in and know what the rules are, and not discover that it's kind of this underground election that's just impossible to basically have a normal democratic. Well, when you have 15% return because it's not publicised and it's not promoted, it's not a normal, it doesn't have the normal election rules apply to it. So you can put whatever you want up on your billboards. There's a lot of issues with it that have been quite well documented. So I guess a question I have is that this is called our submission on the recent Energy Trust election. So I think it would be useful, Mr. Mayor, if I can't be here I've got to leave at 1:30, so I probably won't be here for the debate on this, but it would be good if our submission could make some comments just in terms of that it is an area that perhaps needs to be reviewed. I mean, obviously you don't need to incorporate all of my kind of views on it, but just in terms of that it would be worth it being brought into the normal rules of an election, and that it's conducted democratically.
I've got foreshadowed my amendment before, and have as point 2 of that addition of asking for review of election to bodies with low electoral turnout, low electoral understanding, interest and voting turnout. You could add such as the in-trust elections where there was a 12% turnout. Does that cover your point? It doesn't go into the detail of your concern about it, but it asks for a review of it.
Yeah, if there's something we can add to our submission that does address that election, I think it would be useful.
Okay, that's good, thank you. Councillor Newman.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question's going back to the substance of the draft submission. The submission, I think, and maybe it's sort of related to what Councillor Coombe talked about, but in terms of the information available and the regulation of information during the election period, and the great difficulty of being able to regulate without, I guess, curtailing free speech. I mean, there isn't freedom of defamation in this country. Well, actually, you're not supposed to defame in this country, but I've never been involved in such a filthy election where I and so many people running in it have been subjected to such appalling defamation as what occurred. And yet we haven't made any comment in relation to how information is to be regulated. There's no regulation of third-party advertising. I mean, I got to the curious quandary during this recent campaign where actually some of my opponents were, in the end, presenting my advertising, and therefore I was getting to the point of saying, well, actually, do I actually need to request an amount that third parties are advertising on my behalf, even when trying to use that information against me, for the purpose of my return, because there's such a volume of it occurring that I thought at this stage I'm going to have to start to declare something based on information that's being presented against me by third parties. So is this submission an opportunity to make any comment in relation to advertising and the conduct of parties participating in the election about advertising? Because I think there does need to be something that's said here, and I'm not one of these people that wants to just shut down debate. Some people accuse me of doing that in the past, but it's actually not true. But we don't seem to have covered any of these issues off in our submission. That's the first question. Do you have any comment on that?
Just to check I'm understanding, you're basically talking about the ability to control what we might call fake news, misleading information.
Good luck with that. But I think that part of the issue, part of the issue here in terms of an inquiry about the election is the use of information and our ability to influence the election through the use of information. There are certain things that we can do, there are certain things that are just beyond our control. But I think that if there is an inquiry led by the Select Committee, then we need to actually have some view on that, because I'm sure that most people who participate in the election, whether they won or lost, would have stories to say about the way in which they were presented or misrepresented. And of course, all of this advertising does count. Somebody has to pay for this advertising. It has to be recorded somehow. Candidates who stand for elected public office face budget limits.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of what the role of the committee is, the committee inquires to see if there's any need for legislative change. I'm not sure how you would couch that. You'd have to. I mean, there's an area of exchanges which you might just call political banter, but there's another area which becomes more serious and becomes ugly. But I don't have any solutions for that.
Well, my view is that people who participate in third-party advertising, whether to support or to oppose candidates, actually need to be able to document that for the purpose of returns, because I think that if you are going to participate, usually in a very critical way, then you should actually have to account for that and to report that as an expense.
Yeah, I think some of those points are probably covered under existing legislation. I was taken during the campaign to the Advertising Standards Authority and cleared. My opponent was taken and lost. Matters were referred to the police, to the Serious Fraud Office. Threats were made for defamation proceedings. So all of those sort of things, you know, there are bodies there. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I think what you're looking at is a pretty broad political approach that applies as much in central as it does in local government. And I'm not quite sure the extent to which our submission can properly be targeted at those things at this level. If you wanted to come up with a form of words for them to review, that's possible. But I think a lot of it, Daniel, may be encompassed in resort that we already have if we want to use it, such as the Advertising Standards Authority and such as the law of defamation. Because if you are defamed, you are under the law, you are covered the same as anybody else under the laws of defamation, other than they will make a difference between political comment honestly held and something designed to defame you as an individual. But I think you'd need to be a little bit more precise about what you're seeking to put into the submission. Could you just think about that maybe and maybe come back to us with a thought?
Yes, I will. And I also had another question and just wanted to just scroll down. I think there's another amendment that's with respect to, okay, yeah, I just wondered with respect to and I want to clarify if there's any sort of reflection here to make. Whilst I support the creation of Māori wards, in the context of Auckland, that has to be considered further, in my view, in relation to the role of the IMSB, because I've always felt that you had the Māori wards instead of the IMSB. And I'm just wondering if the mover and seconder of the resolution have given thought to whether Auckland Council should in our submission include a reflection on that, because I don't see that it would be appropriate to have both the Māori wards and the IMSB. I believe that if you're elected on the Māori role to represent that particular constituency, then that's your role, and I'm not quite sure what the IMSB's role would be over and above that.
I don't know, Councillor Casey, whether you want to make any comment about that. I think the point is understood, but it may be consequential on whether or not there was provision in the way consistent with the central government legislation for a Maori ward that might then lead to consideration of the IMSB. But I'm not sure that it's an absolutely a quid pro quo. I think it's an issue that would need to be considered. But the suggestion I'm getting from the mover of that amendment is that she's not prepared to accept that incorporation. Am I reflecting you accurately? Thank you. Sorry. Yep, that's fine. Councillor Cooper.
It seems like people are doing questions and comments. So what should we do? Because
same dilemma as last time. I prefer. Look, sometimes you need to make a comment to make your question make sense. But focus on the question, please.
And reserve my right to speak later. So in terms of your suggestions around licensing trusts boundaries to be the same as local ward boundaries. So if you're saying on the same argument, then why did you not say the same about district health boards? Because if you look at Waitemata and Auckland, they cut right through the middle of the flow local board. And you haven't made a comment about that. So I'm just wondering what the rationale for that was when it wasn't consistently applied.
There seems to have been, we raised the issue of the areas of licensing trusts being very historical. There seems to have been an implication that we're suggesting they be reviewed and changed. That wasn't our intention. It was just to say that these areas which are different to our local government areas does create some complexity and some additional 26 I think it is, additional permutations of the voting documents, but happy to make that an additional comment that we're not seeking a review of boundaries at this point in time, and I'm aware that Councillor Hills has something
About it again. I mean, I think there'll be other people speaking about it, but I'll leave it when it's time to talk.
And I should just note, in case people haven't noted it, that attached to the Kaipatiki Local Board submission is a submission from the Birkenhead licensing.
My other question is just around this B that you've put in there. No, sorry, it's not you. It's whoever's put the B in there. I don't quite understand, because we can actually make a Maori ward anyway under the legislation, can't we?
Yeah,
We
but
can.
under the current legislation, if you were to have a Maori ward, we would have to reduce
No, I know that. I know
Okay,
that. But you're asking them to change the law to allow us to do it, and we can already do it. It's more around. It doesn't. When you're putting an and, it's a whole different thing to change the law for that. You can already do that. It's that we want. If we get more councillors, then we can fairly represent the current wards and do Māori wards. That was the whole reason we didn't do it, because we would have had to cut other representation. And so what I'm saying is it doesn't make sense, because we've already got legislation to have Māori wards.
The other factor I think that's relevant to that, whether we're consistent with central government, in central government you don't have a provision whereby you put to a referendum whether or not you hold it.
But I think it needs to be clearer, Mr Chair, because I'm happy to vote with it, but I think it needs to be clear that this is the provision around a referendum, take the referendum out and determine our own numbers, and then we can get on and do what we want to do. But I think that's just a confusing kind of thing for me.
Okay. Yeah, without debating it here, just simply to say, having it consistent with central government is a powerful argument for us doing it. And being consistent with central government means that you would not have a referendum. My own personal view, to spend $1 million on a referendum that you know from past experience is going to fail is $1 million wasted. So, because what we're saying in this is that it's simply consistent with central government, so not different in terms of other requirements in order to have that representation. Anyway, look, I'll leave that open for debate. Councillor, have you finished your questions? Yes. Yep, thank you. Councillor Shane Henderson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I need to preface this question by stating that I actually live in my ward and I don't have any convictions, but I'm going to ask about those two things. Why is it relevant that in a local election a candidate has to declare whether or not they live in their ward, but electorate MPs do not?
This comes up every time. We do have a position on that, and we conveyed that to the committee, and things haven't changed. Frankly, I forget the reason it came up in the first place. I can't really help you there. It's a provision that it didn't originally exist in the legislation. It was introduced for some reason, and we have it.
It was a member's bill from someone that I can ask. So we're talking. I'll talk about Section 6 here, and the criminal convictions. And in terms of disclosure and standing for election, why should someone who can vote in a local election not be able to stand in one? And is that not a democracy issue?
So I may have fallen into a trap with that. There was, I think the terms of reference or the invitation from the Select Committee was, do you think there needs to be some alignment? And if you look at the Local Government Act, there is clearly words in there which says that if you're a sitting member and you get a conviction that carries with it a possible sentence of a term of imprisonment of 2 years or more, you lose your seat. So the way to align the Local Electoral Act with that is to have similar words in the Local Electoral Act. But look, I think I did fall into a trap there, and I'm very happy with removing it with a disclosure alternative So I don't, that's a political decision.
Sure. Last question. What is the sort of theoretical justification to prevent someone standing in an election if they have criminal convictions? Or why would we make them disclose it? I'm not sure the reasoning behind that. Well, how does it affect the voter on the street?
It's a very simplistic
We
reason.
don't know. I used to be a criminal
Yep.
defence lawyer. Some people are very good people that have made bad mistakes.
Yes. Yeah. It's look, the simplistic reasoning is if you should not be a member, if you get convicted, then perhaps you should not stand if you've had a conviction. But it's been pointed out, Peter Fraser wouldn't have been allowed to be a...
That's right. I just wanted to point out that I kind of feel strongly about this. So removal is almost not enough. I'd actually like us to oppose it if it became a proposal that was going forward, because it's a democracy issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Greg Sayers.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, well, first of all, happy to support the removal of Section 6 there, Your Worship. So it's a steer there. My question, and I think you're about to answer it yourself, Your Worship, but I'll just direct it to the officers, just for clarity about the situation if Maori wards are established, what happens in terms of the councillor's seat at the table.
This kind of falls into the question of whether perhaps it should just be part of the representation review. All it's saying is that of the total number of councillors, you're going to have one councillor who is elected through a Maori ward. I say one because the last time there's a formula for how many you are allowed to have, and the last time we looked at that formula, we could have one. So it just means that of the 20 councillors here, one would be elected from a Maori ward. The other 19 general wards would need to divide the whole of the Auckland region up for 19 positions, not 19 wards, sorry. So it triggers, it does trigger a representation review.
So you happy with that, Councillor? Thank you. Councillor Chris Fletcher.
My question, given the importance of this issue to democracy, is that why have you just got one councillor? Why was it your recommendation as an officer that one councillor present to the select committee? There are different views, as you know, around this table on a whole range of issues, and to do justice to the complexity that is Auckland, I'm curious that you chose only to recommend one councillor.
There was nothing in it. There was, we didn't know even if the governing body wished to speak to it. No logic for just one.
It would be possible to have two. The difficulty is you've got a set period of time. I'm just trying to remember. I should know the answer. I think you get a quarter of an hour to present. It would just mean that you'd be splitting, and that it varies from select committee to select committee, but it could be as little as a quarter of an hour, even maybe less. And then the question was whether you split that speaking time between two councillors. So there's no strong argument to have a councillor, but whoever does represent us obviously represents the council, consistent with the discussion and the voting that will occur at the end of this session.
Well, we can come to that, I guess, during the general discussion. You've heard much of the. Is this actually? Are these recommendations now? Are we dealing with an amendment, or are we dealing with these as the set of recommendations? Could you just give me clarity?
The recommendations, I just need to check with my seconder of the motion, Councillor Young, are the ones that are currently incorporated into the resolution. I do
They're
know
incorporated, that's fine.
Yeah,
That's all
and I
want
do
to
know,
understand.
sorry, just finish this sentence. I do know that Councillor Hills has foreshadowed a change that he'll probably speak to in the speaking section in terms of not changing the boundaries for the local trusts. But if there were changes you wanted to make, this is the time to raise them.
That's fine, it's just that you kept referring to amendments, and I was trying to establish whether these were the incorporated that they have been moved and seconded, and so I just was understanding the status of where we are at the moment. You've heard some of the discussion, Warwick, around things. There is, for some of us, a bit of ambiguity around the issue of the Māori wards, and for me, I feel that the Royal Commission's report was couched in a whole level of research that what we ended up with didn't have quite the same evidential base. What I was hoping for in these recommendations is that we might have some reference to the Royal Commission and that report and the evidence therein, rather than just a sort of random recommendation. Is there a way that, to bring clarity to this issue, that we could find a reference to the original Royal Commission report on Auckland? Because we are dealing specifically with Auckland here. And sometimes I feel that whilst the local government New Zealand linkages are good, we often have challenges and issues that are different for us than other areas around New Zealand. And this is our opportunity to highlight some of those deficiencies in the legislation and perhaps areas that might need review, a legislative review. So I'd like to ask you if there was a willingness by the members around the table here, whether there could be some reference perhaps to the Royal Commission's report that would give substance then and, well, credibility to what it is we're requesting of.
Your Worship and members, could I draw your attention to the submission itself and section 14, which is the Māori wards one. In that we quote the current position of the governing body and the resolution that it passed in 2015. And that refers to a request for a consistent policy regarding Māori representation in line with legislation governing the composition of Parliament. We then move on to issues around review of representation arrangements, and the recommendation following that is indeed a submission to the Select Committee to make a legislative change so that we have discretion to increase the number of councillors. So in amongst there, we could note somewhere in those paragraphs what the recommendations of the Royal Commission were, which from memory were to have 2 entrenched seats for Māori, 2 mana whenua and 1 matawaka, I think.
So that would meet your needs, Councillor, if we were to do that?
Well, I think that it would give greater credibility to this submission, and it would go some way to meeting the needs. I think there were other recommendations that the Royal Commission made that were eminently more sensible than what was ultimately passed. But yes, I would like that reference to the Royal Commission in there, if you could incorporate that. And I would also ask you respectfully if you would give consideration to another councillor attending the Justice Committee. It's, to the best of my knowledge, it's over to the individual Select Committee to nominate the time. Certainly in the years that I chaired Select Committees, you had the option of allocating the time in accordance with the, I suppose, the status of the submission you were to receive. And I'm sure in this case, Auckland could be granted sufficient time for 2 councillors to speak, but I would like to suggest that Daniel Newman be given the opportunity, and I'd be very happy to support Councillor Darby, but I would also like to see another councillor alongside of him so that we can do justice to this very important issue.
Yeah, I think the rules are clear. We can determine ourselves how many people we want to have represented. We will have a common time frame with everybody else for how long we can take it. So if you have more than 1 councillor and you want more than 1 councillor to speak, it's a case of dividing the time that's available to you. And generally, depending on how many submissions there are on this, it would probably be a quarter of an hour, including questions. They might make they might make a special case for Auckland because of its size, or they might not. So it's up to us. And, you know, if somebody wants in the discussion session to speak to having more than one councillor, that's up to the governing body to decide. Happy about that. Councillor Hills.
Yes, I just have an amendment, and it's pretty non-controversial. I don't know if this is the right time, if questions are still in play.
If you've got the amendment, if you can give it to Kalinda.
Yeah, I sent it last night.
Okay, and then you can speak to it as soon as we come to comment. Is that suit you okay?
Yeah. So my just a question then on the, I think it's section 9. I've lost it. We were talking before around the Electoral Commission. We've said we'll investigate it, but the Electoral Commission, you know, maybe not being necessarily responsible for the vote counting and the retrieving of those, but at least the campaign and the enrolment side of things, and the attention that the Electoral Commission could give to the public. What are we doing in that? What does this say, apart from just presenting to the Select Committee? What work are you guys doing around negotiating that, especially around the fact that people go straight to the Electoral Commission website and expect it's all going to link up, because that's where the electoral roll is held, etc.
Until there's a political decision to go that way, I'm not sure that there's no work being done at our end on that.
It says further investigate for the Electoral Commission to conduct local elections. So is that it's in our submission? So how does that link up back to us then, if it's...
Okay, so the Commission held its inquiry into the 2016 elections, and as a result of that, one of its proposals out of that was for the running of local government elections to go to the Electoral Commission. Now with its inquiry into the 2019 elections, it's saying we want to have some feedback about what you people think about our idea of putting the running of elections to the Electoral Commission. And in our submission, we've made a fairly lengthy comment there about what the pros are, what the cons are, and we've landed on saying that it ought to be further investigated. We haven't landed specifically to say, yes, we support a holus bolus move to the Electoral Commission. We think that there are enough positives in it to warrant further investigation. There are some negatives, or some bewares, if you like, and the local boards have identified these as well, and that is that if you have a centralised body, you've got to be careful that you don't lose the things that make different communities different.
So I'm just making sure that what's in here, there's a trigger for some time this year to have this discussion between us all, the pros and cons, and what, you know, like, is what we've got here enough to engage that? Because I personally think one of the positives could be the fact we could have more budget, more attention, more clarity and ease of connection through the Electoral Commission for people to understand what's going on.
I think it's a timing issue. It needs to get through the political hurdles first, and then it becomes something we need to talk about. Well, how is this going to happen? I believe that I mentioned previously the joint effort between LGNZ and Sulgum. I believe that a lot of those with DIA officers are looking at more concrete proposals. I have heard of one proposal which says instead of it going in the first place direct to the Electoral Commission, perhaps it goes to some sort of centralised body, which may or may not be the Electoral Commission. It might be a commission set up to conduct local government elections, but the thing about it is that it's a centralised body.
Thank you. Councillor Simpson.
Well, thanks, Your Worship. 3 quick questions, because I'm struggling with B, because I don't know enough about it. Can you answer me this question first? Is it true that every other council in New Zealand can determine the size of their membership?
Yes, through the representation review, which can be appealed to the Local Government Commission.
Okay. Second question, is it true that every other council in New Zealand can decide whether or not they have Maori seats?
We're all in the same boat on that, and if we decide to have one, then that's subject to a poll.
So they have to ask all of Aucklanders first, A poll, is that what you mean
A
by
referendum.
a referendum? It has to happen.
Yes.
So
If there's a petition for one.
If we ask for a Maori seat, we actually have to agree to a referendum at the same time.
If there's a valid petition.
Under the existing law.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean by if there's a valid petition.
There has to be 5% of people in the electoral district petition for the holding of a referendum.
Okay. And the third question is, can we officially request an extension of time for our submission, noting we're the third of the size of New Zealand?
You can always
can
request
ask.
whether they'd grant it or not. I think this caught me out a little bit by surprise because I wasn't aware until Friday last week that this was coming to us and that was the deadline. What I think we can do is we can agree on fundamentally what's in this submission, but in terms particularly of the low voter turnout, we can then instruct whoever represents us before the select committee to take on board some of the thoughts and the consensus that may arise from us as councillors in the discussion that we have on Monday, and if need be a more formal working group discussion.
Sorry, may I just ask one more question?
Sure.
So if we were to determine our membership, does that mean politically how many years could we say we want 20 people in the next political term, they want 21, 26, 22, 19?
We're required to conduct a review of membership every 6 years. And there's a minimum and maximum range. You can't go above 30, I think it is. Yeah. That's the size of the governing body, which, yes, does.
I think there'd be some practical considerations if we were to increase our size reasonably significantly. I'm not sure we would have the whole of our electorate behind us to do that. But what we're saying here is a matter of principle. Why is Auckland singled out to be treated differently by having the central government determine our size when every other council across the country has the right within limits to make that determination themselves? And that seems wrong to me. Okay, Councillor Newman.
I wanted to clarify. I'm just going back to B again. It's one more question. It's possibly to move in the seconder. But Warwick, you can have a go at answering this. Understanding the representation arrangements for Auckland Council, Part 7 of the Local Government Auckland Council Act 2009 addresses the establishment of the IMSB. That is we're the only local authority in the country that has that particular statutory provision, isn't it? Would the movers of and seconder of B be prepared to, at the end of B, be prepared to consider further wording, comma, and which would require consequential amendments to Part 7 of the Local Government Auckland Council Act 2009 to achieve that outcome? And the reason why I ask that question is that I think that yes, there would be a consequential amendment that would be required to the Local Government Auckland Council Act, but I don't think, and I think if the objective here is to achieve consistency with other councils across the country, you can't address this question in isolation. Part 7 of the Auckland provisions need to be addressed as well, because we are talking about representation on council and committees of council. So would that be something that the mover and seconder could consider?
I regard the matter as involving two separate questions and to be determined sequentially. The first is, should there be representation on council consistent with what central government does and allow for Māori representation for those who opt to vote on that role? The second question is, should you have that, what then would be the role of the IMSB? And I'd want to address that separately and once we'd resolved the answer to the first. So I don't want to say the automatic result of having a Maori ward on Auckland Council would be the abolition of the IMSB. I think there's a much wider discussion that needs to be had. So that would be, that's the way, Councillor, that I'd want to approach it. Councillor Cooper.
Trying to get my name up for when we speak.
Okay.
So
well,
keep it-
I've exhausted
otherwise-
questions,
good,
so I'm now moving on to the speaking list, and Councillor Cooper, you're at the top of the speaking list.
Thank you. So I've got a few things here.
Sorry to interrupt, Councillor. There is another question.
Okay.
Sorry, Linda.
Councillor Casey, and then we'll come to you.
There's an issue that we haven't raised. Well, a few councillors have raised it, and that's the brutality of the campaign. And my question to you, Warwick, is how many complaints were received at council with regard to the election campaign? And how do you deal with it internally?
Of course, every elections there are complaints. My gut feeling, my intuition is that there were possibly more complaints this time. We have noticed that social media has become more ugly more recently. Another thing we noticed, this is not to say that this was ugly, but there was quite a degree of negative campaigning. In other words, don't vote for these people. But that, as I say, that wasn't necessarily ugly. That doesn't answer your question entirely, but I can say that it's our intuition that there was an increase in those type of complaints.
There's quite a lot of confusion out there about who does what to whom in terms of if somebody says something that's inaccurate, like the fake news stuff, there's the defamation stuff, there's other stuff. There's the Electoral Commission, there's the Dale Osofsky's office, electoral office, there's the council, there's the police, and there's all these different agencies involved. And when I'm reading this about the Electoral Commission possibly taking over, the one thing that worries me is they talk about Mad March. The month between nominations closing and voting starting is mayhem month. And I don't think that's been addressed. I'm raising it because I'll talk to it later. Because that's the period where you know who's standing and there's only a month left to kind of make your mark in the world if you haven't started campaigning already. And yet there's, in this submission, it's not humanised. This is no disrespect to the report writers, but there's a human aspect to all of this that's missing. And if this is a review of that election, it was one of the most brutal elections I have ever been in, and I've been a councillor now for 24 years. And I think it's only going to get worse unless we legislate for it, unless we acknowledge it and do something about it. So it wasn't a question, it was a statement.
Thank you for that confession. We come to the speaking order, and it's Linda Cooper first, followed by Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And I do want to acknowledge the huge amount of work that's being done by our officers here in both of these, the last item and this one. So first, there's several things. One, we've got here, where is it? It talks about we either do first past the post or STV, but in our previous item, we said, look, we said we'd do first past the post, and we're not going to change it. We've done that. We've got to decide on at the end of the year, but look, there's no change here. So I don't know why the submission doesn't reflect that, because I personally don't support STV. If I look at the DHB, 50%, 25% of the Waitemata DHB votes were invalid, and 50% of those were due to marking the papers incorrectly, crossing instead of numbering. It's been going on for several elections now, and it also has not delivered either age, demographic, geographic or demographic ethnic diversity at all on the DHB where I live. And so, I just think that if we've already decided as a council that it should be first past the post, and we're not going to have another review committee, why don't we just put that? So that's my view there. Why say either or? because STV has not worked where I live. The second one is around also just commenting, if we're going to talk about licensing trusts having inconsistent boundaries in our submission, we need to say that with DHBs as well, because it is that there's inconsistent boundaries, because the reason you're saying that, I see what the reason is because it creates more permutations of voting forms. Well, the DHB does that as well. So the people in the faux ward some will have ADHB and some will have WDHB. So let's be consistent. If you're going to say for one entity, say it for the other. And also the comments on the licensing trust. Now, I have been on the Waitakere Licensing Trust this is my 19th year, so I do know a little bit about it, and I've been in several elections. So the boundaries have never affected. You have to live in the area. You do have to live in the area, and I do. So, but it's never been an issue. And the other issue is that we're only commenting it because it makes it, when we're issuing the papers, well, that's not us, that's election services that have to do that. This is not about the voters really, because they just get the ones they get. They don't see the other people's voting papers. They just get presented to them, here's the ones you can vote for. The most difficult part of it is the STV part. That's what's causing the problem. So for me, I don't see there's a problem. And also, it's not local government. It operates under the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act 2012, which is about social enterprise. It has commercial and community imperatives. It's not a controlling authority. It doesn't issue licenses. So I kind of see us even commenting about it, other than we think it causes a problem. It doesn't cause a problem for voters. They just vote what's in front of them. You know, if they've got that thing to vote for, they do. The other thing, I want to support Councillor Henderson on this issue of, and it's been addressed a lot, because I know a member of a local board, Waitakere Rangers local board, I think in maybe the first term or second term, brought this up a lot. You know, it doesn't make any difference. We've got a Henderson Massey local board member who lives in Orewa. I live one street out of my boundary. You know, that's quite different. But I have to put that on mine, and I live one street, and not because I moved, but because the boundaries changed. We created the super city. So, and what happens is your opponents use it against you. So I actually think it's kind of just all it does. It doesn't stop people voting for you. It just makes an opportunity for the dirtiness that Councillor Casey's talking about. Another thing to hit your opponent with. You know, if people want to vote for you, they don't care whether you live there or not. If they think you're good, they'll vote for you. If they don't, they won't. And some people will vote for people, and Henderson will vote for people in Orewa. So there you go. So I guess for me, I don't support, I don't support us having that statement, you live out of the area, because it can be very misleading. So I think that's the most important thing for me. Licensing trust, and I think, I just want to know, you sent me your amendment, Councillor Hills? Yeah, because your reasoning was because it makes it difficult. It should be because, you don't want to change licensing trust boundaries, and I know you said you won't, because there are actual commercial imperatives there. And there's also some people who might not want to be in a licensing trust area, and you suddenly put them in. Some people want to be in one, and you suddenly, by the drawing of a line, take them out. So you're not thinking about what people want. You're just thinking about making it easier, so not so many permutations for a voting form. The end. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure the best way to do this, but there's a couple of things. Obviously, Warwick is listening and Rose are listening to what we're saying in terms of how that submission might be amended. And two things out of Councillor Cooper's comments. I think I should just test to see the mood of the majority for changing. We say in the submission under section 10 that there should be the same electoral system, but we don't say which one it should be. Now, I'm assuming, but I want to test, that people prefer first past the post to STV. Could I just get an indication? Please raise your hand if you're in favour of the status quo, first past the post. Okay, there's a clear majority for that, so I think we can make that explicit. The second thing is the requirement to disclose whether you live within the ward or the local board area, whether that should remain a requirement or it should be removed, noting that you don't have to disclose that for a central government election. So for those of you that think that the requirement to disclose should be removed, could you just raise your hand, please? Those against? Oh, it's about half and half, isn't it? Okay, I think if you've got an idea now for those that have spoken against it. If you want to move an amendment, I'd probably have to take it as an amendment and have a formal vote on it. So that's okay. No, I'm trying to short circuit it. So that was the quickest way I could see of doing it. Councillor Hills.
Yes, so I just want to put a price to my original amendment sort of came from Warwick's wording of how to incorporate what had happened in 4, but my view was what Councillor Cooper was saying. What has it got to do with us to remove these boundaries apart from making it simpler for our election services? Well, we pay them to do a job, and it doesn't affect the individual. So I don't think we should be dictating someone else's elections what their boundaries should be just because, yeah. So I've changed it to try and so I've just noted the truth of what the submission has said, because that's what the report says, that the trust boundaries no longer align, but then the change I put is these elections are not connected to local government elections. So there's no good reason why our boundaries should match. The Birkenhead Licensing Trust themselves were very concerned about the change. We were more than triple their size. They're not a trust like some of the West Trusts. They operate completely differently. They would have to triple the amount they pay for the voting documents. They would have to stretch their resources and what they pay into other areas, and it just has nothing to do with the Kaipatiki local board. Yeah, but this is what I mean. It just doesn't make a lot of sense why we would be saying what we did in the submission. So.
Okay, just so again, we could put it as an amendment later and do it formally, but just to get an indication, those that would be happy for the mover and the seconder to incorporate this within the submission, could I just have a show of hands on that? Those against? Okay, we'll incorporate that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have no further speakers, so... Sorry, you're seeking a call, Councillor Darby?
If I might, we just got to clarify the E. Now, I did have a chat, the E.
Yep.
We just got to clarify it.
Oh, okay, yes, of course.
So just to backtrack over lunch, the Deputy Mayor asked me and I said yes, and Councillor Bartley expressed, I'm very aware that this is likely to be a Wellington. If it's in Auckland, maybe we send 2.
Yeah.
1, I don't think we should be sending a fleet of councillors down to Wellington, having declared a climate emergency. And if it's in Auckland, I'm amenable to going along with Councillor Bartley. But in terms of the length of the submission, my experience is you don't want to ask for more time. You actually want to do most of your work in the written, and you're just reiterating points. And leave space for the inquiry rather than ask them for half an hour. Yep.
No, thank you for raising that, because acknowledge that Councillor Fletcher raised the question. I had the same thought myself. If it's in Wellington, my preference probably would be simply for financial reasons to have 1. If it's in Auckland, happy to have 2. But I haven't received any formal amendment. I'm happy to put it to the vote if somebody wants to amend that it be 2 councillors. Alternatively, we will simply seek, when I get to separate, well, maybe I'll do it now before we take the amendments, the recommendations as a whole. 1, to determine whether it's 1 councillor or 2, and if it's 1 councillor, if there's more than 1 nominee for it, who should represent the council if it's in Wellington. If it's 2, I think we've got the flexibility of taking a second person, but equally, the time that you've got is very limited. If it's quarter of an hour for questions and comment, MPs like to ask a lot of questions, so it's a 5-minute one, so it's whether you divide it into 2.5 minutes. Councillor Cooper?
Just my view is that if we're going to do this, we have the highest Pacifica population in the country, and that and we have probably a 50-50 split of men and women as well. So and different types of demographics of wards. Why don't we, if Councillor Bartley wants to go along with Councillor Darby, I think that's a really reasonable reflection of who we send. And mindful that neither will be giving their own views, they'll be giving the council view. So you don't need extra time to give all your different views because you're sent to give the view of this council as voted by all of us.
That's correct. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of other people seeking the call. Councillor Watson.
Speaking very briefly to this now. Yeah, okay. So I'm happy to support too if there's someone else interested that might make for a more dynamic presentation amongst anything else. However, the particular segment that I don't feel that comfortable with is B, and I say that because of the part of the wording there which asks us to consider the creation of Maori wards consistent with central government. Now, what I'm hearing that in real terms, it's not going to be consistent with central government because we've got the anomaly of the IMSB that exists, and we're just kind of pretending that that somehow doesn't weigh into this. For in actual fact, it does, and on a very important democratic principles too. I'm assuming if we're consistent with central government with the wards, which I'm more than happy to support, a Maori ward on the basis, of one person, one vote, so someone that is elected, that's fine. But what we're proposing, given our current structure, which we make no reference to, is not consistent with central government because we will be combining, because it's a separate request, elected people with unelected people in the first instance, and there might not even be a population configuration in the way that it happens in central government with the Maori wards too. So until that's resolved, we're in an anomalous position of seemingly, and certainly that will be the way it'll be perceived publicly, of recommending two things for Maori, like elected representatives, which is fine, I have no problem with that at all, with unelected representatives who are appointed in a new arrangement that has not been subject to any kind of review or study in terms of principles of democracy or how the position of the IMSB might be changed as a consequence here. So this is unsatisfactory as it stands. It's not consistent with central government in the manner in which it will be, which we interpret it in the first instance, and certainly the public will. So that's a difficulty that's posed by that resolution.
Okay. On the question of the councillor, I'll shortly just get an indication of whether the mood of the governing body is to have one or two, if it's in Wellington. On the question of the Maori wards, what's consistent is the ability of Maori people to opt to a Maori role to vote for a councillor. The IMSB is not consistent with anywhere else in the country, but I regard that as a separate, just repeating myself, regard that as a separate question that we will need to address subsequent to any decision being made to have Maori wards. We could have that debate now, but if there is not a chance of getting the Maori ward through, it seems pointless to expend a lot of energy on the second question. Can I just go through the... I've got a long speaking list, so I'll head back to the speaking list. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship, and just your comments you just finished, I totally agree in regards to the separation of Independent Māori Statutory Board and the Māori Ward, so I'll be supporting B. In regards to E and being one of many, I have no doubts around this table who have appeared in front of a select committee, and I did that on behalf of council at the Auckland Airport. Your Worship, that 15 minutes goes really quick, and I know that whoever the councillor is will not have enough time to put the bullet point views that we have. So from my perspective, if it's in Wellington, and I think even if it's in Auckland, I was accompanied with a staff member, and we were sitting there just waiting for questions. Well, we got fired a few questions, but look, the times are going to go fast. So from my perspective in regards to E, I think one councillor. I will support Councillor Bartley attending, whether it be Wellington and Auckland. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, and my name was brought up as a possible option. Look, I'm relaxed with Councillor Bartley. I don't feel that I could match Councillor Darby's experience and his dynamism and vision for this. So, Chris, if you're there too, I will be in awe of you. I just want to make a couple of comments in relation to the resolutions. I don't feel that I can, as someone who appeared before the Royal Commission and supported the Royal Commission's recommendation, substantively supported the recommendations of the Royal Commission in relation to the organisation of Auckland, I don't feel that I can support B at this point, and I'll need to have my vote recorded against that, because, Your Worship, you and I have a different view of this. I don't believe that you can consider this in isolation, and the reason for that is that the statutory provisions that provide for other councils to consider this question, they are set out in statute, and in relation to Auckland, if we want that statutory amendment, you would have to consider that along with the other statutory provision that applies to Auckland, which is Part 7, because that does affect representation. And therefore, I don't feel that at this point I can address this matter by supporting B without some reflection as to Part 7. Now, others will have a different view of that. I respect that, but I need to record my view on the matter. Look, I do acknowledge what Councillor Cooper has said. The issue around licensing trusts, and I do have to point out that I am a trustee of the Woody Licensing Trust. They do exist in accordance with a different statutory arrangement for a completely different reason. Yes, there is a degree of complexity given that you get permutations, but that's just a consequence of an arrangement that applies which sits outside of the Local Government Act. So I don't feel that that is a matter that can be easily reconciled simply on the basis of simplicity of voting. So I think that that is a very important point to note. I think it's something that, yes, there are inconveniences in certain areas, but the reality is that those licensing trusts are quite separate from Auckland Council, and it can't be reconciled simply for the purpose of ease of voting.
Thank you, Councillor. Just to foreshadow how I intend to deal with this, I've got other speakers still to speak. I think we'll go through the recommendations one at a time. When we get to E, I'll ask first of all whether we have one or two councillors to represent the council, and then, depending on that decision, I'll then seek nominations of a councillor. That's probably the fairest and democratic way to do it. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And it's a spirited debate. We were very passionate about our own houses where we live, work, and play. As far as the council to represent, Mr. Mayor, I don't know, you can probably test the room with the hands up again if you like, but I would suggest, with all due humility, that if we're going to have someone that has to go to Wellington, that it would be Councillor Bartley. But if it's in Auckland at the airport, as many of them are, that we have both Chris and Josephine. That might be an elegant solution. As far as the item concerning Maori ward membership, and this is a stepping us through. So at the moment, Auckland is unique in the country as we cannot determine our own membership, yet we're the fastest growing city in the country. My ward, within 5 years' time, the councillor will be representing 130% people more than the MP. And there'll be other wards like Waitemata, and some, and you know, Greg and John and Wayne's ones as well, where it's really fast and it's happening right now. So we need, the first step is we need to be able to determine the number of people around our table. The second step would be around that was, okay, is part of that incorporating a representation from iwi? And then separate beyond that, and I think I see it as a completely separate discussion, is with the IMSB and their ongoing role or not. So I see it in those direct three first steps. The first step is allowing Auckland Council to determine its size and membership. Those are the critical words. So that's like my recommendation, Mr. Mayor, and I will certainly be supporting B in the context in which it is written. The work ongoing will be about what we do subsequent to that decision.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would like to move an amendment along the lines that I expressed to Warwick before, and that would be seeking legislative changes to allow Auckland Council to create Māori wards in the context of the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So it's by way of substitution for the second part of B.
Thank you. I'm just, sorry, Councillor, I was listening to you, but also seeking advice from our officers. And the advice is on B, seek legislative change to allow Auckland Council to determine the size of its membership consistent with other councils, and to consider the creation of Māori wards for the 2025 local government elections, which reflect the provision of Māori electorates in Parliament. So that, if I've got that correct, it just, in your mind, clarifies what the intent of B as it exists, and I'll come back to you, Councillor, in just one moment. That's what you're suggesting?
That's just to clarify what the words consistent with central government means.
Okay. I'm happy if, Councillor Young, if you're happy to accept that as a clarification, then I'll come back to what Councillor Fletcher is suggesting as an amendment you're wanting to put up, and maybe if I can ask you just to give us the words for that. You want it to say for the 2025 local government elections which reflect the recommendations of the Royal Commission.
Which reflect the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So it's by way of substitution for the second part of the words there. So seek legislative changes to allow Auckland Council to create Māori wards in line with the recommendations of the Royal Commission.
But also including to determine the size of its membership consistent with other councils? Yeah, because that's vital.
Sorry,
okay,
that
no,
was
just wanted to clarify that.
I was making, it was by way of substitution just to the provision on that section of the Māori wards.
Okay, so if I get you, we've got a note of that. When we come to vote on that, we'll vote on the amendment first, and then if the amendment lapses, we'll go to the substantive. If the amendment passes, then that passes. That becomes the substantive. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to briefly speak in support of B as written, just in line with your reasoning. And I also want to add my support behind the Deputy Mayor's words as well, that any discussion of IMSB and its future workings and existence has to actually happen with IMSB. So thank you. That's where I stand.
We've got further comments. I see Councillor Bartley. You were seeking a call.
Thank you. I'm absolutely in support of B, and I agree with the comments that if there's any discussion about IMSB, it should be with IMSB in regards to their future. And I also not going to put myself forward to go and speak to this at the Justice committee hearing. I'm quite happy for Councillor Darby to do it. He's the visionary and can obviously hold Councillor Newman in awe, unlike myself. So I just put myself forward because I don't have an agenda or an opinion, so I could reflect that of the council, but I'm going to follow the rest of the majority of my demographic and just disengage. So thank you.
Councillors, you're not making it easy for the chair, but if I take that, Councillor, and I do want to take it seriously, that you are withdrawing in favour of Councillor Darby. Okay, thank you. That clarifies that. Now, have we got the B amended as the amendment recommended by our officers to make it clearer? Okay. I'm pretty much got in my head what the change was. If we let's go through it. There's no other speakers. Let's go through it. The recommendations first of all, which I've got here. Sorry, Tracy, you are speaking. That gives us a little more time to put up the amendment.
I'll give you some time. I'd like an amendment to have 2 councillors represent. Sorry, you've just moved it now. It's on here. Item attend. Sorry, could you please just scroll? Oh, 1 minute. I'll scroll. Because I would like to see 2 councillors represented, and one of those being Councillor Bartley and the other being Chris Darby. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take that as amendment when we come to it. So the amendment will be taken first, which is nominate 2 councillors, and if you think that there should only be 1, you'll vote against that. If you think there should be 2, there'll be 2. And then once we know the number, I'll then take nominations for who should represent us, if that's clear. Right, let's go back to, sorry, if you can scroll down so we're at the, it's at the bottom now. That's Councillor Fletcher's amendment, and I want to scroll back to the top to see what the substantive consistent. No, just keep it on B there. Determine the size consistent with the council and allows councils to consider the creation of. Now, the change I think was recommended by Warwick was on B. Just stay on B, please. Which is. In line, sorry, you've probably got it on, in line with the provisions for central representation in central government. Sorry, can you just clarify that, Warwick? No, it won't be the 2. It will be one or the other. I think we had, if you've got that piece of paper, I can read off it. Thank you. So it's seek legislative change to allow Auckland Council to determine the size of its membership consistent with other councils, and full stop. Also, to also seek legislative change to allow Auckland Council to consider the creation of Maori wards for the 2025 local government elections, which reflect the provision of Maori electorates for Parliament. Which is, it depends on the number of people on the Maori roll as to the number of representation, electorates, Maori electorates that there are in Parliament. So it's done on exactly the same basis as the wider electorate, and the numbers can go up if more Maori people elect to vote on the Maori roll, and go down if they choose not to. So I think I'll wait till I've got officers to have that on the screen, so I don't want any confusion about it. Yeah, Councillor Stewart.
Thank you. Just on B, is there any reason why we can't, we could have part of B as BA and B2, the legislative change to allow council to determine the size of membership consistent with other councils.
So you could vote for one and not the other.
And then for the other, which is to seek legislative, so have it be,
no, I think that makes sense. Happy to do that. So if our officers have just taken that on board,
And if we could have a division?
So it would be B1, seek legislative change to allow Auckland Council to determine the size of its membership consistent with other councils. B2, to seek, you don't need the word also then, to seek legislative change to allow Auckland Council to consider the creation of, okay, we'll wait till they've got it up.
May I ask a question while they're mucking around? May I, please?
Sorry, yep, question, Councillor
May I ask
Simpson.
a question? Just to give you some time and just for clarification for myself. So I absolutely support what Councillor Stewart's saying. It's a bit about the Maori wards that is confusing for me. We have the, and I just want to seek clarification. Councillor Fletcher, is it correct that Councillor Fletcher, by referring to the Royal Commission, and the trouble is I'm having difficulty voting for this because I just can't remember and I haven't got all the facts. Does that mean Maori wards and no IMSB? That's one thing that we could vote on. And the other bit is this one up here, which says, let's determine our size, then if we have a Māori ward as per the number of Māori who live in Auckland and they vote, one person, one vote for a Māori ward done differently. And aren't they the same? So the only difference is the IMSB. And my question is, where does the legislation, we haven't addressed that there is already a piece of legislation saying Māori representation is done this way. And I'm just getting confused. I don't know which is which. I might just vote against it, so I don't know.
No, let's try and clarify it. Firstly, I think we're working on the assumption that if we are to have a Māori ward or wards, that would be net additional to the 20, not at the expense of the 20. I don't know any councillor that has expressed a view other than that. With regard to Councillor Fletcher's amendment, it doesn't explicitly refer to doing away with the IMSB, and I'm not sure, Councillor Fletcher, whether you wanted that incorporated or left separate.
No, I don't wish it incorporated.
Okay,
The
that
case, for
clarifies
those who are not familiar with the Royal Commission, the case was made very compellingly for the social, cultural and many other advantages for having Māori seats at this council. And without wanting to go into screeds and pages here as to why there might be a case, I think the Royal Commission speaks eloquently on that, and that is why I am trying to align it to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. And in actual fact, that is consistent with other what you're trying to do with the earlier one. But I want to link it to the Royal Commission.
Okay, I hope that those 2 points clarify. Shall I try again? First of all, the assumption is, I think, of everybody around the table is to have a Māori ward, it should be in addition to the existing wards, not at the expense of an existing ward councillor. That should be clear. Secondly, Councillor Fletcher's recommendation is not to have it consistent with the way Parliament is elected. That depends on the number of people who are on the roll, but rather to just follow the Royal Commission representation. If you believe that the removal of the IMSB is a prerequisite, there isn't an amendment to suggest that, but if you thought that that was really important, you'd vote against either of these. Okay, now I've got, sorry, I had Councillor Sayers at one stage on this. You're still there? Let's take a comment, Councillor, from you.
Right, thank you, Worship. And it's helpful because things have progressed, and it's probably I feel more confident in commenting now, especially with your recommendation to split up B. But I do want to say that I support the bulk, or basically all the recommendations that are up there, and I'm happy to support them. I'm also happy to support the removal of Section 6, Your Worship, which you were indicating earlier. Supportive of that. I probably will have to vote against B2. My feeling is that it's really, in my mind, a constitutional matter and needs to go to referendum to be, pro or con. So we'll just have to see there, but that's my point. I also think that the current situation with the Māori Statutory Board needs to be well explained to voters at that point in time. Also, Councillor Cashmore, I think, made a very good point around E there. If we do have two councillors that would like to attend, that if it's in Wellington, perhaps one goes to Wellington. If it's in Auckland, then perhaps the two. So I would just encourage any councillors that are considering those positions were to put their names forward. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I need a seconder for Councillor Fletcher's amendment. Do we have a seconder for that? We put it up, seek a legislative change. It's on the bottom there. So do we have a seconder? If not, that will lapse for want of a seconder. Sorry?
Can I second that if I've already spoken? I did have a question on that.
You can second it.
Well, I had a question on
Okay, I'll have to come back to you because I've got a speaking list already. I just want to make sure we had a seconder. So we have a seconder. Councillor Casey.
I'd like to know what the recommendations of the Royal Commission are. Maybe Councillor Fletcher can enunciate them, because that doesn't make any sense without the enunciation.
Okay, she has explained it once, but would you like to add to
I
that?
need to know about the numbers of Māori seats and how they are constituted.
The recommendation was based on 2 Māori seats on the basis of the diversity of Auckland, the importance of the Treaty of Waitangi, and increasingly what has occurred, and that is the co-governance dimension looking forward. I'm happy to provide Councillor Casey. I have this in storage at the moment, and apparently we have to remove everything on the 26th floor in terms of storage. I'm very happy to share my copy of the Royal Commission if Councillor Casey is unfamiliar with it. I think it is a really important document in terms of understanding where we're at right now.
Thank you. Councillor Hills.
With respect, Mr Mayor, in my speech in presenting on the Māori seats, I actually enunciated the position of the Royal Commission. It was 3. 2 for Māori, by Māori, and 1 representative appointed by Mana Whenua. So it's 3.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. You're right in terms of Mana Whenua and Matawaka.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Councillor Hills.
Okay, I'm not meaning to throw a cat amongst whatever's going on here, but why didn't we just use this? Why didn't we just use the same wording as we used last time and 2015? I'm just wondering, because last time we said receive the report and reiterate to the government the position adopted by Council in 2015 supporting need for legislative change to allow Auckland to determine the number of members. Subject to that, we agree in principle to establish a Māori board and request for a consistent policy regarding Māori representation in line with legislation governing the composition of Parliament, which is what we passed the last 2.
That is consistent with what we've done on 2 previous occasions, and it's practically identical to the substantive motion. It says exactly the same thing, so thank you for pointing out. That's helpful. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I'm prepared to second this, Your Worship, is I think that if you were to adopt what the Royal Commission said, not what Mr Rodney Hyde subsequently determined, if you were to adopt what the Royal Commission said, then Part 7 of the Local Government Auckland Council Act would not apply. It would be a consequential, it would be removed. And it wouldn't be a debate with the IMSB, it's got nothing to do with them, because actually they exist in statute, and that is the statute that applies. I don't think that this amendment's perfect, but frankly, I think that the Royal Commission model is a better option than the current position that seems to be supported, which was the Rodney Hyde position, which is to have this Part 7 provision of the Act, which seems to have outlasted its use by date, in my view, because actually we have the ability with the Māori option and with the growing interest of Māori in Auckland in the elections to be able to address that through the Māori ward option and use the Māori roll for that purpose. So I'm happy to support this amendment, but I do think that B2, as currently stated, is not sufficient given that it doesn't address Part 7 of the Act.
Okay, I'm just going to seek clarification. I'm not totally au fait with what the Royal Commission said in detail. Accepting the recommendations of the Royal Commission, did that include the existence or otherwise of the IMSB? Has anybody got that information?
The recommendations of the Royal Commission did not include a proposal for the IMSB. The IMSB came about as a compromise when the government of the day would not accept the recommendations from the Royal Commission.
So I need clarification then from the mover and seconder whether the implication of that amendment is that we would not have an independent Maori statutory board, because that's not clear to me in considering the amendment. I don't know, Councillor Fletcher, whether you can clarify that.
I can't completely clarify that, because my understanding, I mean, I thought it was very clumsy by the government of the day. I felt that it was disrespectful to mana whenua that they had not adopted those recommendations that were well considered. My understanding of the IMSB, and I had the opportunity being part of the inaugural council and involved in the oversight of the setup of the IMSB, is this is something that this council could have chosen to have done in any event. So I don't see it as being mutually exclusive, but I would need to have legal advice on it. My intention with this amendment is solely to link it to the recommendations of the Royal Commissions, for the very reason that others have spoken of the difficulty of referendums and of racism and of all of the unpleasantness that has come about. There is a very thoughtful piece of advice in the recommendations on the Royal Commission for the strategic advantages that it would bring Auckland to have natural representation as of right for mana whenua and for tangata whenua.
Okay.
And I believe that strongly. I think my feeling is that the majority of people are in agreement with this. It's just about how you go about the implementation of it. And I believe that to avoid the possibility of a rather just token gestures, we go and do something, there's referendum and there's a lot of polarisation and toxicity in the debate, there has been a body already look at this and present very strong recommendations for it.
Thank you. I think I'm going to have to leave governing body members to make up their own mind whether the amendment then means that there'd be an abolition of the IMSB or not. Last speaker, and then I think we should move to voting. We've taken quite a long time over this. That's appropriate because it's important, but I think we're practically on the point of being able to vote. Councillor Cooper, I think you've got the last call.
It was that question, does this mean that we're kind of by stealth going no IMSB if we vote for this amendment? Because we haven't had a real discussion about that, and that's what I'm trying to understand. But you just said we don't know.
No.
So that means I can't vote for it.
Thank you. Right. If I can ask officers just to scroll to the top, and I'll go through the proposals one at a time, putting the amendment first where that's appropriate in two cases. Okay, happy to do it by division. It's been called for. Can we scroll down, please, so we can see what the... Okay, no, right to the top so I can look at A, please. Where are we? Okay, A. So everybody can see A there. There is no amendment to A, so I will put that resolution. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no.
No, sorry. Yes, no. Sorry.
She's tough. Councillor, can I give you one chance to be definitive about this? Is it a yes? Thank you. Right. We come to Amendment B, and just scroll up a little bit on that. Actually, we put the amendment first. Well, shall I put B1? That's easy. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Now, when it comes to B2, I'll put the amendment first. If you scroll down so we can read Councillor Fletcher and Newman's amendment. Yep. Yes. So I'll put the amendment first. If the amendment passes, it becomes the substantive motion. If it fails, we go back to the substantive motion. So
Call for a division for this.
it's a division. It's been called for by division. So I'll ask officers to conduct a vote on the amendment. If you're in favour of the amendment, obviously it's a yes. If you're not, it's a no.
Okay, so voting on the amendment to replace clause B2, Mayor Goff.
No.
Councillor Bartley.
No.
Councillor Casey.
No.
Deputy Mayor.
No.
No.
Councillor Cooper. Councillor Dalton is not here. Councillor Darby.
No.
Councillor Filipina.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes.
Councillor Henderson.
No.
Councillor Hills. Councillor Mulholland.
No.
Councillor Newman.
For.
Councillor Sayers. Councillor Simpson. Councillor Stewart. Councillor Walker is not here. Councillor Watson. Councillor Young.
Okay, so I'll declare the amendment lost, and we move back to the substantive amendment, so you can just see that. I'll now put the substantive amendment for B2, and we haven't had a request for a division on this, have we? By division? Okay. Thank you, Councillor Casey. So if I can ask officers to call the roll.
Okay. Mayor Goff.
Aye.
Councillor Bartley.
Yes.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor.
Yes.
Councillor Cooper.
Yes.
Councillor Darby.
Yes.
Councillor Filipina.
Aye.
Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Henderson.
Aye.
Councillor Hills.
Aye.
Councillor Mulholland.
Aye.
Councillor Newman.
No.
Councillor Sayers.
No.
Councillor Simpson. Councillor Stewart. Councillor Watson. Councillor Young.
So I'll just get the total on that one, please. It's carried by 11 votes to 6. Right, we move now to recommendation C. I think I've just put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Recommendation D. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Now, for recommendation E, the amendment was to have 2 councillors. I'm not sure, was that formally moved?
Sorry, that was, I actually made the amendment. And my amendment was nominate 2 councillors to attend the Justice Committee hearing. I did not state a specific region or area.
Okay, that's fine. So we've got a mover of that. Have we got a seconder for that? Seconded by Councillor Cooper. So the amendment is nominate 2 councillors to attend the Justice Committee hearings. I'll just do it on the voices, I'm presuming. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. Carried. I think default, but shall I do that one again?
Tracy Mulholland. And then seconded by Cooper.
Okay, I'm happy. There was a large silence around the room. So, okay, so we have 2 councillors, and now the next thing to do is to ask for nominations, and I had the nominations, well, Councillor Mulholland.
So I would like to nominate Councillor Bartley and Councillor Darby.
Okay, that's been moved and seconded. Are there any other nominations? So I'll put those nominations. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. The last recommendation is recommendation F. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Right, thank you. It was long drawn out, but we got there, and I think everybody